Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. So, when you think about the history of Australia, what comes to mind? The thing is, its story is really two incredible stories, running side by side. One is absolutely ancient, stretching back some 65,000 years. We're talking about the world's oldest living culture. The other story is much more recent, just the last couple of hundred years, and it's a dramatic tale of collision, gold rushes, and constant reinvention. So, how do these two timelines come together to create the Australia of today? Well, let's dive in.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start way back with the continent's first peoples. Then we'll jump to a huge turning point, the birth of a penal colony. From there, it's all about the gold rushes that pushed the colonies towards federation. After that, we'll look at the massive trials the new nation faced in the 20th century. And finally, we'll land in the vibrant, multicultural Australia we see today.
Okay, first up, ancient land, first peoples. And to really get this story right, we have to rewind the clock. I'm not talking a few hundred years. I mean tens of thousands of years. Because long before any European ships ever appeared on the horizon, Australia was already home to this incredible mosaic of complex, thriving, and deeply spiritual societies.
Yeah, just look at this number, 65,000 years. Let that sink in for a second. Human history in Australia starts at least 65,000 years ago. That's when the first people made their way from Southeast Asia, likely during an ice age when sea levels were much lower. And what that means is, and this is no exaggeration, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are literally the oldest continuous cultures on the entire planet. It's just mind-blowing.
And over this vast stretch of time, you see this amazing story of adaptation. For instance, about 41,000 years ago, we find the remains of Mungo Man, which shows some of the world's earliest evidence of ritual cremation. That tells us just how complex their spiritual beliefs were, even that far back. And as the planet itself changed, people adapted. When the Ice Age ended, sea levels rose and cut Tasmania off from the mainland. And way up in the north, a whole new seafaring culture popped up among the Torres Strait Islanders, just constantly evolving.
So what did this society actually look like? Well, it wasn't one single group. You're talking about a complex tapestry of hundreds of different clans, speaking something like 250 distinct languages. Pretty amazing, right? For the most part, these were egalitarian societies. No kings or formal chiefs. It was all about kinship, family, and cooperation. But the absolute core of everything was their spiritual connection to the land, often called the dreaming. It's this incredibly deep worldview that explains creation, lays down the law, and shapes ceremonies. It was the glue that held their entire world together.
All right, now we're about to hit a major turning point in the story. This is where a completely different world arrives on the shores of the continent. And this wasn't just a simple meeting of cultures. It was a genuine collision of two worlds, and it would change the course of Australia's history forever, and often very violently.
So, for centuries, European mapmakers had this idea, almost a myth, of a terra australis incognita, an unknown southern land. They figured there had to be a giant continent down there to balance out Europe and Asia on the globe. Now, Dutch sailors had bumped into the western and northern coasts and called it New Holland, but it was Lieutenant James Cook in 1770 who really filled in the map. He sailed up the entire fertile eastern coast, charted it, and claimed it all for Great Britain, naming it New South Wales. And that single act set the stage for everything that was about to happen.
And this is a really fascinating and crucial piece of the puzzle. When Britain decided to establish a penal colony, a big reason was that they just lost their American colonies and had nowhere to send their overflowing prison population. But look at the official instructions given to the First Fleet's commander, Captain Arthur Phillip. They were crystal clear. He was told to conciliate their affections and ensure everyone lived in amity and kindness. So on paper, the plan was peaceful coexistence.
But the reality on the ground was a whole different, tragic story. First, there was disease. Things like smallpox, which the indigenous population had zero immunity to, just wiped out entire communities. An outbreak in 1789 is estimated to have killed half the Aboriginal people just around the new settlement of Sydney. Then, as the colony grew, conflict was inevitable. These were brutal frontier wars over land and water. And ultimately, it was about dispossession, the taking of the land that had sustained these cultures for millennia, shattering their economies and their spiritual world.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit, because the 1800s are when things really start to accelerate. We're moving from a scattered set of penal colonies to something completely different. One single discovery is about to kick off a population boom, spark a fight for democracy, and start forging a brand new Australian identity.
And what was that discovery? One word: gold.
In 1851, it was found near Bathurst in New South Wales, and then, bam, even bigger discoveries in the colony of Victoria. The news just exploded. It spread like wildfire around the planet, and suddenly it felt like the entire world was stampeding its way to Australia. I mean, just look at these numbers. The impact was absolutely staggering. In 1851, the population was under 500,000. Just 10 years later, it was well over 1 million. It nearly tripled. People were flooding in from everywhere. Britain, China, America, all over Europe, all chasing the dream of striking it rich. And this didn't just change the numbers, it transformed society. Cities like Melbourne went from being tiny little towns to massive booming metropolises, seemingly overnight. Now, when you get that many people together that quickly, all demanding their fair share, it's going to fuel calls for political rights. Out on the gold fields, miners got fed up with the government's expensive mining licenses and heavy-handed rule. This all boiled over in 1854 at what's called the Eureka Stockade. Now, the rebellion itself was crushed pretty quickly, but its legacy was huge. It became this powerful symbol for democracy. And in the years that followed, the colonies started getting self-government and even pioneered innovations like the secret ballot. And in fact, people around the world started calling it the Australian ballot.
So, by the end of the 1800s, you've got these 6 separate self-governing colonies, each with its own parliament, its own stamps, its own army. And a new idea starts to take hold. Why are we separate? Why don't we unite and become one single nation? And you have leaders like Sir Henry Parkes giving these powerful speeches, talking about the crimson thread of kinship that runs through them all, urging everyone to unite. And after years of conventions, debates, and referendums where the people got to vote, they did it. On January 1st, 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia was officially born. The 6 colonies became 6 states, united as one nation. And that's a really important part of the story, right? This nation wasn't forged in a bloody revolution, it was created peacefully at the ballot box. But you know, becoming a nation was one thing. Surviving the 20th century was another challenge entirely. The brand new country was about to be tested in ways its founders could never have possibly imagined, through the crucible of 2 world wars and a devastating global depression. So when World War I breaks out in 1914, Australia is in. No questions asked. They're part of the British Empire, and it's the 1915 campaign at Gallipoli that becomes this foundational moment for the nation. Now, militarily, it was a disaster, but the story that came out of it, the legend of the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, was all about bravery, sacrifice, and this idea of mateship. It came at a staggering cost, with over 60,000 Australians killed in the war, but it helped forge a sense of what it meant to be Australian. After the war came a brief boom, but then the crash. The Great Depression hit Australia incredibly hard. See, its entire economy was basically built on selling things like wool and wheat to the rest of the world. When global trade seized up, the Australian economy just fell off a cliff. By 1932, unemployment was at nearly 30%. I mean, almost 1 in 3 working people were out of a job. It was a time of real, widespread hardship. Then comes World War II, and with it, a strategic shock that changed everything. See, Australia had always sheltered under the protection of the mighty British Navy. The cornerstone of that plan was the huge naval base in Singapore. But in 1942, the unthinkable happened. The impregnable fortress of Singapore fell to Japan. Suddenly, Australia felt incredibly vulnerable to invasion. And in that moment of crisis, Prime Minister John Curtin made a speech that changed history. He declared that Australia now looks to America. This was it. This was the fundamental pivot in foreign policy from Britain to the United States. Okay, so that brings us to our final chapter, the post-war era. This is where Australia truly transforms into the country that we would recognize today. What happens after World War II wasn't just a small adjustment. It was a profound social transformation that would change the face of the nation for good. Remember that feeling of vulnerability from the war? Well, it led to a powerful new national mantra, populate or perish. The thinking was pretty simple. Australia was a huge continent with a tiny population, and it needed more people to grow and be secure. So the government launched one of the most ambitious immigration programs the world has ever seen. It started by trying to bring in people from Britain, but very quickly expanded to welcome millions from war-torn Europe, and eventually from every single continent on the globe.
And the result? Well, it was nothing short of transformative. Just look at this. Today, nearly a third of all Australians were born somewhere else. That's huge! Since 1945, over 7 million migrants have made Australia their home. And this massive wave of new arrivals completely reshaped the country, helping to finally dismantle the racist White Australia policy and creating the vibrant, dynamic, multicultural society that exists today.
So when you step back and look at the whole thing, it's an incredible story, isn't it? From the world's oldest living culture to a penal colony, a gold rush frontier, and now a modern, multicultural nation. The whole story is one of constant reinvention, which of course leaves us with the big question, what comes next? What will define Australia's next chapter as it grapples with reconciliation with its indigenous peoples, its place in a rising Asia, and the massive threat of climate change?
If you enjoyed that quick trip through Australia's history, we've got a whole playlist of these quick, concise country histories that you should definitely check out. And for more explainers that make complex topics clear, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.